The room was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of silence that presses against the chest. Outside the hospital in Valencia, traffic continued as usual, engines humming, voices rising and falling, life refusing to pause. Inside, a man who had once made an entire stadium hold its breath lay surrounded by machines, his body broken, his future already slipping away. Jesús Montero was no longer the name that echoed through ballparks or filled headlines with promise. In that final moment, he was simply a human being, alone with the weight of everything that had come before. For years, his story had been told as a rise and a fall, a cautionary tale of wasted talent. But standing at the edge of his last chapter, those labels felt painfully small. This was not just the end of a baseball career. It was the quiet extinguishing of a dream that had been lit too early and burned too brightly. The kind of dream that begins in childhood, grows louder with every swing of a bat, and eventually becomes too heavy for one person to carry. He had once been the future. Reporters said it without hesitation. Coaches repeated it with pride. Fans believed it because belief was easy when the ball jumped off his bat with that kind of force. As a teenager, he was already being spoken about in the same breath as legends, his name rolling through scouting reports like a promise carved in stone. To many, he represented more than talent. He represented possibility, the idea that a boy from a modest Venezuelan town could stand beneath the brightest lights in sports and belong there. But promises are fragile things. They shine from a distance, yet up close they reveal cracks that no one wants to see. From the outside, his life looked charmed, blessed, almost unreal. Inside, the pressure never stopped building. Every at-bat carried expectation. Every slump felt like a personal failure. Every whisper about discipline, weight, or attitude cut deeper than the cheers ever lifted him. Long before the world noticed his silence, it had already begun to form. In the final days of his life, there was no crowd chanting his name, no camera following his movements. The spotlight that once defined him had moved on, chasing younger faces and newer stories. His struggle had become invisible, and invisibility can be more painful than criticism. When the accident happened, it shocked those who still remembered him, but for many others, it was a name from the past resurfacing only because tragedy demanded attention. Yet the accident was not the true tragedy. The true tragedy was everything that led there. The years spent trying to reclaim something that kept slipping further away. The training sessions in empty fields. The phone that did not ring. The hope that refused to die even when logic said it was over. He had been taught from a young age to fight, to push, to believe that effort would always be rewarded. No one had prepared him for the moment when effort was no longer enough. Those closest to him would later say that he never stopped loving the game, even when his career unraveled, even when doors closed quietly without explanation. Baseball remained the language through which he understood himself. Without it, he felt unanchored. Success had arrived so early that it shaped his identity before he had time to build anything else. When it faded, it left behind a silence that was difficult to endure. In that hospital room, surrounded by uncertainty, the story reached a point of no return. Not with drama or spectacle, but with stillness. A stillness that mirrored the way his journey had ended long before, away from the noise, away from the applause. The world would soon remember him again, briefly, in articles and tributes that summarized his life in neat paragraphs. But those summaries could never capture the complexity of a man who had lived between expectation and reality, hope and disappointment, brilliance and doubt. This is where his story truly begins. Not with the contract, the debut, or the headlines, but with the silence that followed them. The silence that reveals what happens when a promise falls, and no one is listening closely enough to hear the impact. Long before the stadium lights and television cameras, his world was smaller and louder in a different way. Jesús Montero grew up in Huacara, a town where baseball was not an escape from reality, but an extension of it. The crack of a bat against a worn ball echoed through narrow streets, mixing with laughter, arguments, and the dust kicked up by children chasing dreams far bigger than the neighborhoods that held them. In that environment, talent was noticed early, sometimes celebrated before it could even understand itself. Jesus was one of those children, bigger than the others, stronger, already swinging with a natural power that drew attention from adults who knew what they were seeing. At home, expectations grew quietly. His family supported him with pride, but also with an unspoken understanding that his gift carried responsibility. Baseball was not just a game. It was opportunity. It was stability. It was a possible way out. For Jesus, the field became a place where he felt valued, where effort translated into applause, where success came with a clarity life elsewhere did not always offer. Coaches praised his discipline. Scouts wrote his name in notebooks. Each compliment pushed him further down a path that seemed inevitable. As a teenager, the attention intensified. Trips to showcases replaced ordinary routines. Conversations shifted from school and friends to mechanics, conditioning, and projection. Adults spoke around him, about him, and sometimes for him. They discussed his future as if it were already written, as if the only uncertainty was how high he would rise, not whether he might fall. When the call finally came, when the contract was signed and his name became tied to one of the most storied franchises in sports, the moment felt unreal. He was still a boy, but the world treated him like an investment. Leaving Venezuela meant more than changing teams. It meant stepping into a culture that demanded constant performance and offered little patience for growth that did not follow a perfect curve. Training facilities were pristine. Expectations were ruthless. Mistakes were magnified. For someone who had always stood out physically, the differences were subtle but relentless. He was no longer the most talented player on the field. He was one of many prospects, each fighting to prove they deserved a future that only a few would ever reach. At first, he thrived on the challenge. His bat spoke loudly. Numbers followed. Rankings placed him among the best young players in the game. Media narratives painted him as the next great power hitter, a cornerstone for years to come. With every article, the image of who he was supposed to become grew heavier. Praise became a double-edged blade. It lifted him, but it also sharpened the fear of disappointing those who believed in that image more than they understood the person behind it. The isolation of professional life crept in slowly. Clubhouses were filled with noise, yet connection was fleeting. Teammates came and went. Coaches rotated. The constant movement made it difficult to anchor himself emotionally. He learned early to hide uncertainty behind confidence, frustration behind silence. Admitting doubt felt dangerous in a system that valued toughness above vulnerability. When struggles appeared, whether physical or mental, he internalized them, believing they were personal failures rather than natural parts of growth. Cultural distance added another layer. Language barriers, different expectations, and subtle judgments followed him daily. Comments about conditioning or defense carried an edge he did not always know how to respond to. Each critique felt like a test he was failing publicly. Instead of asking for help, he worked harder in isolation, convinced that effort alone would restore the narrative that once surrounded him. Success came in flashes, enough to keep hope alive, but not enough to quiet the noise. He debuted on the biggest stage, and for a moment, it seemed as if everything had aligned. But beneath that moment lay years of accumulated pressure, unresolved doubt, and an identity tied too tightly to performance. When circumstances shifted and opportunities changed, the foundation he had built began to crack. What the world saw was a promising career navigating normal challenges. What Jesus felt was a constant evaluation of his worth. Every move, every statistic, every rumor carried weight. He had learned how to hit a baseball before he learned how to protect himself emotionally. When praise faded, there was little left to cushion the fall. This background matters because it explains the silence that followed later. The silence did not begin with failure. It began with a childhood where success came too fast, with an environment that celebrated potential without teaching resilience, and with a system that demanded results while offering little room for imperfection. Long before the accident, long before the headlines about decline, Jesús Montero was already carrying more than most people ever realized. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic collapse. It came quietly, disguised as routine decisions and professional logic. One season, he was at the center of plans, spoken about as a long-term answer. The next, he was informed that he was being moved, traded as part of strategy that made sense on paper but felt deeply personal in reality. For someone whose identity had been built around belonging, the message cut sharply. It was the first time he understood that promise did not equal security. In his new environment, the expectations did not disappear. They simply changed shape. The label of future star followed him, but now it came with questions. Could he adjust? Could he mature? Could he prove that the doubts whispered behind closed doors were wrong? At first, he answered in the only way he knew how, with effort and flashes of production. The numbers were respectable, even encouraging, but they were no longer enough to satisfy a narrative that demanded greatness. Average performance felt like failure because the ceiling that had been set for him was impossibly high. Then his body began to betray him. Injuries arrived at the worst possible moment, interrupting rhythm and confidence. Recovery forced him into waiting, watching from the sidelines while others took the chances he believed were meant for him. Rehabilitation rooms became familiar. Each setback fed frustration, and frustration slowly hardened into anger, not directed outward but turned inward. He pushed himself to return quickly, fearing that time away would erase him from relevance altogether. When the suspension came, it changed everything. The announcement was clinical, procedural, yet the impact was devastating. His name was suddenly associated with scandal rather than promise. Even those who believed in second chances grew quiet. For him, the punishment was not just the games missed, but the shift in perception. Trust evaporated. Conversations became guarded. He insisted he had not intended to break the rules, but intention mattered little in a system that judged outcomes. Returning from suspension should have been a moment of renewal. Instead, it exposed deeper issues that had been building for years. He arrived out of shape, physically and emotionally unprepared for the scrutiny that followed. The criticism was swift and public. Coaches spoke about disappointment. Analysts questioned commitment. Each comment reinforced a growing sense that he was no longer seen as an asset, but as a problem to be managed. The incident that followed would become a symbol of his unraveling. During a minor league game, frustration boiled over in a moment that seemed almost absurd on the surface. A small act, meant as mockery, struck a nerve already worn raw. His reaction was immediate, emotional, and visible to everyone. What should have been a forgettable footnote instead became a defining image. It circulated quietly through the sport, an unspoken shorthand for lost control. For observers, it was proof of immaturity. For him, it was the release of years of humiliation and bottled anger in a single, irreversible moment. After that, the chances grew fewer and smaller. He was given brief opportunities, short windows to prove he could still contribute. Each time, the pressure was suffocating. There was no room to grow into form, no patience for adjustment. Every at-bat felt like a verdict. When he failed to deliver immediately, the door closed again. Eventually, it stopped opening altogether. He refused to accept that this was the end. He signed minor deals, traveled between organizations, crossed borders in search of another chance. Each uniform represented hope, but also a step further from the spotlight he once knew. He played in different countries, different leagues, often far from the attention of mainstream media. The crowds were smaller. The facilities were humbler. The pay was modest. Yet he kept going, driven not by money or fame, but by a need to prove, perhaps mostly to himself, that his story was not finished. Privately, the emotional toll was heavy. Friends noticed the change. Conversations that once revolved around future plans became quieter, cautious. He trained alone more often, trusting routine over connection. Nights were spent replaying decisions, wondering where things had gone wrong, wondering which version of himself might have survived if circumstances had been different. The belief that talent would always carry him forward had dissolved, replaced by a harsher reality. The sport moved on without ceremony. New prospects emerged, new narratives replaced his. Mentions of his name became rare, usually framed as a reminder of what could go wrong rather than what could go right. He became a cautionary tale without being asked whether he agreed with the lesson. By the time he returned to his hometown more permanently, the battle had shifted inward. Baseball was still there, still loved, but it no longer defined every breath. He spoke about teaching, about giving younger players guidance he never received. There was a softness in his voice that had not been there before, a humility shaped by years of struggle. He was trying to rebuild meaning from the pieces left behind, and yet the weight of everything he had lost never fully lifted. The silence that followed him was not peaceful. It was heavy with unanswered questions, with the echo of expectations that once roared so loudly. This was the phase of his life few had witnessed, the space between falling from grace and finding redemption, where identity is tested more brutally than any public stage could ever allow. The consequences of his unraveling did not arrive all at once. They spread slowly, seeping into every corner of his life, until even the smallest routines felt different. What had once been structure became uncertainty. Schedules changed without warning. Conversations with teams became shorter, more cautious, often ending without clear answers. The sense of belonging that once defined his days dissolved, replaced by a feeling of being tolerated rather than trusted. Psychologically, the shift was profound. He had grown up believing that effort and talent would always find their reward, that setbacks were temporary obstacles on a straight road forward. Now the road felt circular, looping back on itself no matter how hard he pushed. Confidence, once effortless, required conscious effort. He questioned his instincts, his preparation, even his love for the game. Doubt became a constant companion, whispering during quiet moments and resurfacing after every failed opportunity. Socially, the distance widened. Some relationships faded naturally, unable to survive the change in circumstances. Others ended more painfully, strained by misunderstanding and unspoken disappointment. He noticed how quickly admiration could turn into silence. Invitations slowed. Messages went unanswered. The realization that many connections had been built around his potential rather than his person was difficult to accept. Loneliness followed him even in crowded places, a reminder that success had once served as a bridge between him and the world. Financial pressure added another layer of stress. The security he once took for granted no longer felt guaranteed. Decisions that had seemed insignificant before now carried weight. Travel, training, medical care all required careful planning. The contrast between his early promises and his present reality was impossible to ignore. It was not just a professional loss, but a reshaping of lifestyle and identity. Public perception shifted as well. Media coverage became sporadic and shallow, reducing years of struggle to brief summaries. Headlines framed his story as a decline rather than a human journey. Nuance was lost. Context was ignored. He was no longer discussed as someone fighting circumstances, but as an example, a warning, a footnote. That simplification hurt more than open criticism ever had. Being misunderstood in silence felt heavier than being challenged in the spotlight. Emotionally, grief took many forms. There was grief for the career he imagined, for the version of himself that once believed anything was possible, and for the trust he had placed in a system that offered little protection when things went wrong. At times, anger surfaced, sharp and consuming. At other times, sadness settled quietly, lingering without explanation. He learned to live with both, carrying them into training sessions, conversations, and long stretches of reflection. Yet the impact was not entirely destructive. In the absence of constant expectation, something else began to emerge. He found moments of clarity, small but meaningful. Teaching younger players brought a sense of purpose that competition no longer provided. Sharing his experiences, both successes and mistakes, allowed him to reframe his story. He began to see value in honesty rather than image, in guidance rather than validation. These moments did not erase the pain, but they softened its edges. Family relationships deepened in unexpected ways. Away from the noise of professional sports, conversations became more genuine. Support no longer came with conditions or timelines. There was comfort in familiarity, in being known without having to perform. Those closest to him saw both the weight he carried and the effort he made to keep moving forward. Their presence grounded him during periods when motivation wavered. Physically, the toll of years of strain lingered. Injuries healed imperfectly, leaving reminders of battles fought and lost. Training became about maintenance rather than dominance. He listened to his body differently, learning its limits through necessity rather than choice. Each ache reinforced the passage of time, the reality that opportunities once missed rarely return unchanged. The broader consequence of his story extended beyond personal loss. It exposed the fragile nature of promise in professional sports. How quickly admiration can transform into abandonment. How systems built to identify talent often fail to nurture resilience. His journey highlighted the absence of safety nets for those who stumble, especially when they stumble publicly. It raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility, patience, and the cost of treating young athletes as assets rather than people. By the time his life approached its final chapter, the aftermath of his struggles had already reshaped him. He was no longer chasing the image others had created. He was learning, slowly, to define himself on his own terms. The silence around him remained, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with reflection, with lessons earned painfully, with an understanding of how far-reaching the consequences of early expectations can be. This was the weight he carried into his final days, a mix of regret, resilience, and quiet determination. Not the ending anyone had imagined, but a reality shaped by choices, systems, and moments that could not be undone. It was in this space that his legacy truly began to take form, not in statistics or headlines, but in the impact of his experience on those who came after him. There were chapters of his life that never made headlines, moments that unfolded far from cameras and commentary. These were the years when he lived between hope and acceptance, when effort continued without applause, and when survival depended more on inner resolve than public validation. In these quieter spaces, Jesús Montero revealed parts of himself that few ever saw. He trained early in the mornings, long before fields filled with noise. Sometimes it was alone, sometimes with a small group of players whose names would never trend or be debated on television. The drills were basic, repetitive, almost meditative. He focused on fundamentals, on movement rather than outcome. Those sessions were not about reclaiming a past identity, but about preserving dignity in the present. He rarely spoke during them, saving his energy for the rhythm of work. Friends noticed how his conversations changed. He no longer spoke about proving anyone wrong. Instead, he spoke about understanding the game in a different way. He talked about patience, about the cost of shortcuts, about how easily confidence can become arrogance when unchecked. These reflections were not delivered as lectures. They surfaced quietly, often late at night, when honesty felt safer. He acknowledged mistakes without excuses, recognizing how immaturity and misplaced trust had shaped his path. There were nights when doubt returned uninvited. He would replay moments in his mind, decisions that could not be undone, the trade that shattered his sense of belonging, the suspension that stained his reputation, the confrontation that became symbolic of frustration rather than context. Each memory carried weight, yet he resisted bitterness. Those close to him recall how he refused to blame individuals or organizations directly. He believed responsibility was shared, and that growth required ownership even when circumstances felt unfair. In Venezuela, his presence took on a different meaning. Children recognized him not as a fallen star, but as someone who had reached a place they only imagined. He coached informally, corrected swings, encouraged discipline. He emphasized education alongside sport, repeating that talent alone was fragile. Watching young players listen intently, he seemed lighter. Purpose replaced pressure. Teaching offered redemption without requiring public forgiveness. Privately, he worked on plans that reflected a quieter ambition. He wanted to build something lasting, something that did not depend on his name alone. Conversations about opening a small training academy surfaced repeatedly. He envisioned a space where guidance would be as important as performance, where mistakes would be addressed rather than punished. It was a way of transforming his own experiences into protection for others. Emotionally, these plans represented healing. They allowed him to reframe loss as instruction. The game that had taken so much from him also gave him language to give back. He no longer chased validation through contracts or rosters. He sought meaning through connection. That shift did not erase regret, but it softened its sharpest edges. Those closest to him recall moments of unexpected joy. Laughter returned in small bursts. He enjoyed simplicity, shared meals, casual conversations that did not revolve around baseball. The absence of constant judgment allowed his personality to surface more freely. He was reflective, thoughtful, occasionally self-critical, but no longer consumed by the need to be exceptional. Still, the weight of unrealized potential lingered. Silence could be comforting one day and oppressive the next. He understood that some narratives never fully resolve. Acceptance did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to live alongside what might have been. He carried that understanding with humility, aware that many athletes never receive the chance to process their endings with such clarity. In these final, less visible years, he became more than the sum of his public failures. He became a witness to the cost of expectation, a reminder that success achieved too early can distort growth, and that systems often celebrate outcomes while neglecting well-being. His story during this period was not dramatic, but it was deeply human. These hidden chapters mattered. They shaped the man he was becoming, the lessons he hoped to pass on, and the legacy he was quietly constructing beyond statistics. They remind us that behind every promise that fades, there is a person learning how to continue, how to redefine worth, and how to find meaning after the noise has faded. When the noise finally faded, what remained was not a list of numbers or a highlight reel, but a set of questions that refused to disappear. His life invited reflection not because it was extraordinary in outcome, but because it exposed the fragile space between talent and fulfillment. Jesús Montero had once embodied the idea that potential alone could carry someone forward. His later years quietly dismantled that belief, revealing how easily promise can become pressure and how little guidance exists when that pressure becomes overwhelming. His legacy does not rest comfortably in celebration or condemnation. It exists in contrast. He was proof that early success can distort identity, teaching a young person to measure worth through performance before they learn how to protect their inner life. He was also proof that failure, when it arrives publicly and repeatedly, can isolate even the strongest individuals. In his story, achievement and loss are inseparable, each defining the other in ways that cannot be neatly summarized. Looking back, it becomes clear that the system around him valued production more than development. He was trained to succeed, but not prepared to struggle. When setbacks appeared, the response was evaluation rather than support. Expectations were recalibrated without explanation, and trust was withdrawn quietly. His experience forces an uncomfortable acknowledgement that professional sports often mistake resilience for silence, assuming that those who do not speak are coping, when in reality they are simply enduring. Yet within that harsh reality, there's something enduring. He never stopped trying to understand his journey. In moments of reflection, he spoke about accountability without self-destruction, about learning without surrendering dignity. He recognized that his mistakes mattered, but he also understood that they did not define the entirety of who he was. That balance, difficult to achieve after years of public scrutiny, is part of what makes his story resonate beyond the field. His later focus on mentorship and community revealed a quieter form of success. Without fanfare, he chose to redirect his knowledge toward those just beginning their own paths. He spoke honestly about pressure, about how praise can become a trap, about the importance of building a life that does not collapse when a career falters. These lessons were shaped by pain, but delivered with empathy rather than bitterness. They were not designed to rewrite his past, but to prevent others from repeating it blindly. The tragedy of his final days sharpened these reflections. It reminded the world that behind every fallen promise is a person whose story continues long after attention moves elsewhere. His passing reignited interest, but only briefly. The deeper meaning lies in what can be learned before the spotlight returns, and how institutions respond to those they once elevated when the ascent ends prematurely. His story challenges the audience to reconsider how success is defined. Is it measured only by longevity and accolades, or by the capacity to grow, adapt, and give meaning to loss? In that sense, his journey holds a quiet lesson. He did not achieve the career he imagined, but he arrived at an understanding many never reach, that worth is not erased by failure, and that dignity can survive even when dreams do not. The legacy he leaves is therefore incomplete by design. It resists closure. It asks parents, coaches, organizations, and fans to reflect on their roles in shaping young talent. It urges patience, humanity, and responsibility in systems driven by results. It also speaks directly to those who have stumbled under expectations they did not choose, reminding them that identity can be rebuilt even when the process is painful and unseen. In the end, his life stands as a reminder that the most important stories are not always the loudest. Some unfold in silence, teaching lessons slowly, demanding attention not through spectacle, but through honesty. His journey invites us to look beyond outcomes and ask harder questions about care, preparation, and compassion. That is where his true legacy lives, not in what he achieved, but in what his experience reveals about the cost of dreaming without support. The story does not end with applause or closure. It ends the way many lives do, quietly, leaving behind echoes rather than answers. Jesús Montero did not receive a farewell tour or a moment where the world collectively paused to acknowledge what he once represented. His departure was understated, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity, as if the noise that once surrounded him had exhausted itself long before his final breath. And yet, in that silence, something honest remains. His journey forces us to confront how easily admiration can turn conditional. When he was rising, belief came freely. When he struggled, belief became rare. The same system that celebrated his potential stepped back when certainty disappeared. This pattern is not unique to him, but his life makes it visible in a way statistics never could. It reveals how young talent is often embraced for what it promises, not for who it is becoming. For those watching from a distance, it is tempting to reduce his life to a simple narrative. A gifted athlete who did not fulfill expectations. A warning about discipline or choices. But simplicity does not do justice to complexity. His story is not about excuses or blame. It is about how early success can shape identity before maturity arrives, and how the absence of support during failure can leave lasting wounds. There is a moment in every fallen career when the person must decide whether to disappear entirely or redefine themselves away from the spotlight. He chose the harder path. He stayed connected to the game without demanding recognition. He tried to transform experience into guidance, disappointment into empathy. Those efforts may never trend or attract headlines, but they mattered deeply to the people who encountered him in those final years. His life also speaks to a broader audience beyond sports. Anyone who has been praised too early, defined too narrowly, or abandoned when usefulness faded can recognize themselves in parts of his story. The feeling of being valued for potential rather than presence. the confusion that follows when identity collapses alongside ambition, the slow rebuilding that happens without witnesses. These are human experiences, not athletic ones. In remembering him, the question is not whether he succeeded or failed. The question is what his story asks of us. It asks organizations to reconsider how they nurture young talent, not only physically but emotionally. It asks fans to reflect on how quickly they move on and what that movement costs the people left behind. It asks parents and mentors to prepare children not only for success, but for disappointment, because both are inevitable. His absence leaves a quiet space where reflection can grow. There are no dramatic revelations waiting to be uncovered, no secret explanation that suddenly makes everything make sense. What remains is the understanding that some lives are shaped more by pressure than by opportunity, and that survival within such systems requires more than skill. It requires patience, guidance, and compassion that are often in short supply. As this story closes, it does not demand judgment. It invites perspective. It asks you to look at the moments where silence replaced support, where potential became expectation, and where a person was left to navigate loss alone. It challenges you to think about how many similar stories unfold unnoticed, how many promises fade quietly without ever being understood. If his journey leaves you unsettled, that discomfort has purpose. It means the story has reached beyond entertainment and into something more reflective. It means you're being asked not just to remember him, but to consider how you respond to failure in others and in yourself. Because in the end, his legacy is not a warning etched in statistics. It is a question, lingering, unresolved, and deeply human.